if someone is listening to this and they read your article and they hear this podcast and they basically they're concerned with wokeness, they think you're right, it's connected to civil rights law, and they're convinced by your articles. What would you advise them as far as what they should look for in politicians, or this could be advice for politicians too, or leaders? What would you want, like a Republican administration? Obviously, we can always think of legislation Congress could pass. I think that's probably unrealistic. But as far as what would you want to say in the next couple years out of the courts and out of the executive branch, assuming a Republican is in office, to push back against this stuff?
I think most of what needs to be done in the courts right now, because we need to undo some of this stuff. And right now we've got pending before the Supreme Court a case against Harvard University and a case against the University of North Carolina about race preferential admissions. And I think another root of wokeness comes simply from these programs where students who happen to be from an underrepresented race, but are often members of the upper middle class themselves, they are admitted to a school where their entering academic credentials put them towards the bottom of the class. And some students are going to outperform their entering credentials. Other students are going to underperform their entering credentials, but most students are going to perform right about what their entering credentials say. They're going to do the same level of work they were doing in high school, or shown by standardized tests or whatever. And that has been part of the ugly stew of identity politics and wokeness, where you've got students who would have done splendidly at a school that's like one rung down or two rungs down, but end up towards the bottom of the class and are resentful on account of it.
Yeah, and they put. Often they have these programs that these studies courses that aren't they're less challenging subjects, and they're very ideologically driven. And you can see how that would compound the problem.
We'd have more African American STEM majors going on to medical school, going on to a job in the sciences and engineering, and instead we get more that are in these programs that are highly ideological. And that's got to stop. We've got to come up with a way to stop that. And that will affect the culture. It will take another 30 years to have more successful African American adults in STEM areas and in other areas. But that's the first thing on the list. Disparate impact. We need to be able to make the argument now. Again, it's got to be made to courts. Disparate impact is in fact unconstitutional, because the 1991 Act, alas, enshrined, or at least arguably enshrined, disparate impact into the statute. And that's been a big problem. And the easiest way out of that now, and it's not an easy way, is to be able to argue that that is basically a form of discrimination itself. And so that's another thing. One more thing. You talk about it in the paper a little bit. So that argument for disparate impact to be unconstitutional, can you just explain that real quick? Well, for one thing, basically it has always been held that it only applies to women and racial minorities. So that's the way it's always been applied. In which case, we protect women, we don't protect men. We protect we protect African Americans and Latinos. We don't protect whites, and usually we don't protect Asians, although sometimes that works the other way. That's got to survive strict scrutiny all by itself there. And I don't think it has a prayer of doing that. And what progressives have argued is, well, we'll apply it to everybody. Well, that's utterly incoherent. That means that nothing, can ever be good, but it still discriminates, because in certain kinds of industries and certain kinds of job qualifications, we'll protect whites in certain areas and we'll protect blacks in other areas. That's still, that's just more discrimination.
So the basic argument is that Title VII, by saying you have to worry about disparate impact as an employer, you're basically forcing an explicit discrimination, right? You're basically you have this one evil, and then you fix it by an evil that's more suspect. You can't force someone to discriminate. You can't do this explicitly. You can't say you have to discriminate against white men, but you can't say nothing that has a disparate impact against blacks, which ends up just being, discrimination against whites, right?
pick the job qualifications that are good for African Americans and therefore are not as good for other groups,
Yeah.
even if they're not as useful at locating the right employee. You're protecting African Americans at the expense of non-African Americans, or you're protecting Latinos at the expense of non-Latinos. And that's discrimination in itself. It would have to survive strict scrutiny. I don't think it can. And I don't think saying, well, sometimes we'll protect whites and men against disparate impact. That doesn't help because it just means you've ghettoized everything. So in areas where whites don't do particularly well, but African Americans do, you're going to have to then choose job qualifications that disadvantage the African Americans, and they're being discriminated against. If you did it for sports and said, you have to change the qualifications for getting a job in the NFL so that more Asians can get in or more whites can get in or more women could get in, then, you're basically harming people on the basis of their race or sex.
So so you say, yeah, affirmative action. You wanted the courts to do something on affirmative action. The best thing to do would be say disparate impact is unconstitutional. Anything else you're looking for out of the courts or any other branch of government?
Oh boy, there's so many things. I mean, when it comes to education and all this CRT stuff, I don't really want the federal government to get involved there. I think part of the problem in the world is that we've centralized too many decisions, and I am much more interested in having education issues become more local, and in part that means making it possible for more charter schools, making it possible for more private schools, and I want education to be more decentralized, and I think that will generally help. So I'm looking for a president, I'm looking for a senator, I'm looking for state legislators who see that and know that decentralizing education is important. Education is one of those things where it's hard to measure and it's hard to know what's a good education and what's a bad education. So the best defense we have is always going to be, let's make sure that we're going to let a lot of different approaches reign.
Yeah. It's hard. I mean, it's hard to know. You see this woke stuff in schools. We have no idea how prevalent it. We can have anecdotes. We don't know if it's all 100% of schools now or 10%, or it's really impossible to tell. You're right. I think our ability to even know how well the government is doing is difficult. So I think you got to decentralize it. You might as well give people choices. What do you think about it? I mean, I've always thought that an obvious place to start, Executive Order 11246, basically said if you have to have affirmative action among federal contractors. I looked it up. This covers something like 30% of the American workforce. I mean, government contractors are a lot of their subcontractors too. This seems like low-hanging fruit, right? It's just an executive order. You repeal it or you circumscribe it. That is this any legal problem or political problem with doing that?
There's a political problem. There's a political problem with all of this because
of course, yeah.
People that benefit from preferences of this sort, they'll fight to the death to keep it. Whereas people who are generally on the conservative side of this, this is not their number one issue. It's like it's number 10. And so you get the usual problem of the most vociferous people are going to be those who are saying, no, we want to keep racial preferences, we want to keep sex preferences. Should it be repealed? Yes. And if you look back into the 1970s, there was a case about under Title VII, and it was the Supreme Court case, a 5-4 decision, the Weber case, that said that even though Title VII says on its face you can't discriminate on the basis of race, they did the same thing they did in Griggs, say, well, the purpose of all this is to help African Americans, so you can discriminate in favor of African Americans and have that sort of a discrimination. They would limited it to a case where the employer had discriminated in the past, as Kaiser Aluminum and the Steelworkers Union had done prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And that has been taken ever since as permission to discriminate. And one of the interesting things about the case is that the court says, well, why shouldn't the steel workers in Kaiser Aluminum, the employer, be able to voluntarily, give preferential treatment? And the whole decision is, oh, this is voluntary. And I thought, for goodness sake, the discrimination in the past was voluntary too, but it was bad, it was bad. But the funny thing is it wasn't really voluntary. It was being pressured by the executive branch pursuant to Executive Order 11246 that, called upon anybody that does business with the government to have essentially quotas. I mean, they deny that it's a quota, but, come on, when you tell employers, we really, really want you to aim to have a large number of minorities. They're being told they have to do this, and you say jump, and they're going to answer how high, and that's what's happened.
Go back to what you said about conservatives, this not being their main issue. I think that's, I think when we connect the civil rights stuff to wokeness. Wokeness, I think, is, pretty much the main issue. I mean, you look at the, what's driving people. I mean, what's driving conservative media? It is really over the top. And so I think, if you put it as, executive orders on affirmative action or disparate impact standard in Title VII, no, that's not going to make the top 100. If you say this is wokeness, that thing you really, really hate and you keep talking about, it's literally this, it gets close to number one.